Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thousands of Carillion workers have been urged to come into work as normal and promised they will be paid after waking up to the news the construction giant had gone into liquidation. Carillion's collapse is expected to affect its contracts for hospitals and prisons, as well as high-profile projects like HS2. After a weekend of crunch talks, the government admitted it is regrettable, but insisted the taxpayer can't be expected to bail out the company.
A small proportion of those government contracts that went to Carillion were awarded after the profits warning in July last year, and some of those actually involved decisions that were taken before the profits warning, just the announcement came afterwards. But if you look at the detail, where those contracts were awarded, the department concerned built in joint venture arrangements to make sure that the other contractors had to come forward, step in and take up the duties of Carillion if anything were to go wrong. So the protection for public service delivery was there.
But Carillion has 450 contracts with government. How many of those contracts were awarded after that first profit warning last summer?
I think that it is 7 plus one that is a local authority contract. It's desperately sad for the board and the employees in particular of Carillion what has happened, and we'd hoped that they were going to be successful in having a deal with their bankers. But I think the message has come through clearly that the government is not going to step forward automatically and bail out risks undertaken by the private sector.
There are some big winners here. Let's not forget the hedge funds are pocketing probably £300 million in profits. They gambled against the government and won. The taxpayer is going to have to pick up the pension liabilities and other losses, and thousands of individuals and small companies are going to go bust. I mean, this is extremely unfair, and it's got to make a lot of people very angry.
So, what do we know about Carillion? It's the UK's second largest construction company. It has contracts to build and run hospitals, prisons, army accommodation and schools as well. Current big projects include high-speed rail 2 and also the London Corby line. Carillion provides facilities management to 875 separate schools, 50 prisons across the country as well. Also the largest provider of facilities management to the MOD and a major provider to the NHS as well, providing services that affect more than 3 million patients every year. Carillion employs 43,000 people worldwide. Just shy of 20,000 of those are here in the United Kingdom. The company was once valued at £2 billion. In 2016, Carillion had a turnover of £5.2 billion, but it also had debts of £1.5 billion, £900 million worth of debts, plus £600 million pension deficit. Last year, it issued 3 profit warnings and its share price plummeted, leaving the company worth just £61 million. With its collapse, there are questions over the company's current building contracts and also the provision of major public sector services.
Well, the Shadow Business Secretary Rebecca Long Bailey has told Sky News that there should now be an investigation into why the government continued to award contracts after Carillion had issued profit warnings.
This firm issued 3 profit warnings, not just 1, 3 profit warnings over the last 6 months. Yet even after those profit warnings were issued, government still handed new contracts, for example HS2 to Carillion. Now this contravened government advice and government policy to deem a company high risk if a profit warning was issued and to refrain or reconsider awarding new contracts. So we fully require an investigation into the conduct of the government on this matter.
So what do we know about Carillion? Well, the company employs 43,000 people and is worth £2 billion of government contracts. It employs 43,000 people worldwide, 20,000 in the UK. The company was once valued at £2 billion, but has debts of £1.5 billion. Carillion is involved in running NHS hospitals, prisons and schools. It also has contracts to build HS2 and upgrade part of the Midland Main Line route. Last year, Carillion issued a series of profit warnings, but it was still awarded £2 billion worth of government contracts.
Well, the head of the Black Country Chamber of Commerce says the government now needs to reassure contractors.
Well, there's some real immediate things that need to happen, and the first thing is reassurance around some of these contracts. The way that these big construction contracts work is that the contractor down, then subcontract below that, and there'll be contractors all over the country at the moment waking up this morning not sure if they've got work at the end of the week. So we need to know what happens to those really big contracts and how that works. So the first thing is reassurance from government. Beyond that, we as partners locally need to get together to make sure that those people in that building and our contractors have all the support they can get.
Let's get more then from our city editor Mark Kleiman, who's in Westminster. Mark, there's a lot to this story, isn't there? The taxpayers potentially on the hook for a lot of cash. The pension fund involved here has got big problems, and ultimately this was a business that proved or didn't prove too big to fail.
No, that's right, and it's an interesting point, Colin, given that the government of the day decided to bail out the banks a decade ago, but Mr Liddington, who we saw there, said it was inappropriate to use public money to bail out Carillion, which of course is embedded in many aspects of British public life through its arrangements and involvement with schools, hospitals, prisons and transport projects. A number of developing lines on this story, Colin, one of which I've uncovered this morning. Although Carillion had about £900 million of debt at the holding company level, my understanding is that the losses facing the banks which lent to Carillion could be as high as £2 billion. Now, that's because a number of Carillion's subsidiaries also had credit lines with banks and other complex financing arrangements. So in total, the amount that banks such as Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds and RBS stand to lose from their exposure to this giant construction group could be as much as £2 billion. On top of that, the Pension Protection Fund, which is responsible for paying compensation to members of pension schemes who were employed by companies which go bust, that's facing a bill from the collapse of Carillion of up to £900 million, according to estimates that have been passed to me this morning. So we're talking about some absolutely vast numbers, some vast losses for a company that, when it collapsed, was worth on the stock market just £61 million. It's pretty extraordinary, really, the scale of what appears to be corporate mismanagement, because these profit warnings that took place over the last 6 months and resulted in a clear out of the boardroom at Carillion had taken place after doubts had been raised in the city about the pricing of contracts that Carillion was entering into. Those doubts were always dismissed by the company's management, but clearly there was some real substance to those concerns. And then one other developing line, just very quickly to bring you, Colin. Balfour Beatty, the big infrastructure group which is listed on the London Stock Exchange, had a number of joint ventures with Carillion, including the Aberdeen Bypass, the A14 in Cambridgeshire and the M60 Junction 8 to M62 Junction 20 scheme. They were joint ventures between Balfour Beatty and Carillion. Balfour Beatty has just put out a statement saying that it will continue to work on these projects and absorb Carillion's responsibilities, but that it will also face a cash impact of between £35 and £45 million during the course of this year. So already we are seeing the financial consequences of Carillion's collapse impacting on some of its major competitors and joint venture partners.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, John Triggett is the Shadow Cabinet Office Minister and he joins us now from Westminster. What's to be done?
Well, look, the first thing is we need to make sure these public service contracts are honoured. 50 prisons, 200 operating theatres in hospitals and all sorts of other services now in some risk. The government must immediately guarantee that those services will continue. I'm having reports already of workers being laid off all over the country. The government must act. I've been warning them for some months now this was going to happen. And then secondly, we need to review the way in which we hand over really huge amounts of money to profit-making companies who cream off the profits and then just leave the debts with the public sector, and that is unacceptable. Then thirdly, we have to have an explanation from the government why they went into this open-eyed, knowing the state of Carillion, but failed to stop the contracts flowing across. This is taxpayers' money, and it's a disaster.
But they're not using taxpayers' money to bail them out, and they are confident that all of the contracts that they went into, like we've just heard with Balfour Beatty, that the slack is going to be picked up by the other companies working alongside.
Well, let's see what happens. I'm very worried about the supply chain. You know, all those small firms working in the building industry and elsewhere, used by Carillion, can they stand the debts which they're going to not be paid now? I am worried about this, and also about the jobs, but more importantly, hundreds of thousands of people depend on the public services which Carillion was supposed to be provided, and the government knew the company was in trouble, as we've just heard, and yet failed to stop any further contracts being handed over. It is a disaster, I'm sorry to say that.
The government says it did due diligence. What do you think went wrong?
Well, when they say they did due diligence, what it means is they looked at the company's accounts, they knew that the company was in trouble, and continued to hand over contracts because they had other objectives in mind. Honestly, I think we need a full inquiry into this, but the first thing is we need immediate action, and I think some of these services will have to be brought back into the public service immediately, because we can't have hospitals, surgeries closing in the middle of this NHS crisis, the same with schools, and clearly we can't have prisons which are not being managed. So some of these services will need to be immediately brought back in-house, it seems to me.
Yeah, we've heard Sky News has done a bit of research with the NHS this morning. It appears that the NHS not being as heavily impacted as perhaps other public service. The majority of the contracts, it seems, for hospitals are for catering, cleaning, porters and maintenance, and the NHS sources are saying that trusts have contingency plans in place. So at least mercifully it does appear that the implications for the NHS might be minimal.
Well, let me just put this to you. A hospital which is not being cleaned, let's say that's all that they're doing in a hospital, it's not a safe place to be. So we may say, well, cleaners are not so important. Actually, they are. But I'm told that there are also operating theatres up and down the country. 6 hospitals being managed by Carillion. Look, I think we need a full statement in the House this afternoon from the government. I was asking questions last Wednesday. I didn't get satisfactory answers, and we must have them today.
Do you think that the government should now spend taxpayers' money on sorting this out, or do you think that they're right to stand back and say this is Carillion's problem, Carillion needs to do it?
Well, look, the government itself has made these disastrous decisions to continue handing contracts over, taxpayers' money, to a firm they knew was going bust. I'm not surprised that they're saying that. And let's see where we finish up. But I'm not in favour of any further money going into Carillion itself, which has been deplorably managed. By the way, they've had 3 separate chief executives recently, and as long ago as 2015, the shares were being sold off. Look, this has been a long time coming, and it's time that the government immediately acted today to save the services and protect the jobs and pensions.
What about retendering? Do you think that should happen in some of these locations?
I think the easiest, well, look, quite a lot of this work is in the private sector. How that's handled is up to the liquidators, and I hope that's done quickly, because so many people depend on Carillion for work and for services. But for public services, the easiest way is to simply say we'll bring them back in-house. I mean, prisons ought to be run by the public service, not for profit. It just seems to me so basic that is the case, that it not to have been done in the first place. So we're looking for these services to come back in-house into the public service straight away.
And what about pensions? The pensions regulator is telling Carillion pension holders not to be alarmed. Are you confident that they won't then lose out?
I'm not confident yet. I think we need to know more about the pensions. It's almost £1 billion. And there again, if the government is saying there's no taxpayers' money going in, how are they going to protect the pensions of the workforce? And clearly, all of this need not have happened had the government acted speedily and in time many months ago when this problem first emerged.
OK, John Trickett, good to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
More on the morning's breaking news, the collapse of the construction company Carillion after the government declined to use taxpayers' money to bail them out. Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington joins us now live from Westminster. Mr Lidington, good morning to you. First of all, I want to talk about the staff, people going in to work for Carillion in hospitals, schools, HS2, people who rely on the services they provide. Are they safe?
Come in today, you will be paid. I mean, the government has money in the budget for those wages and salaries. Until this morning, we were paying those via payments to Carillion. From today onwards, we are paying those wages and salaries via the official receiver and then into the pay packets of the workers concerned.
For how long?
That will be a matter, depends on the official receiver, but I think our intention is that we manage this in a way that we ensure continuity of those key public services. And over time, as the official receiver goes through the books of Carillion, some of those Carillion contracts will be allocated to other contractors, and others will be taken in-house by government departments or government agencies. I think it'll be a mixed pattern of what happens.
The ones that are taken in-house, what is the cost to the taxpayer?
Well, that will depend on the exact circumstances, but as I say, the money for the provision of those services had already been put into the budgets of those departments and agencies.
How much was it? What's the figure?
It will depend on which one you look at. So if you talk, you will need to talk to each department, and in many cases we're talking about local level decisions. So for example, you're looking at individual National Health Service trusts, individual schools or local education authorities that have got contracts of one kind or another with Carillion, perhaps for maintenance, for cleaning work. And each of those will decide in consultation with the official receiver how best that work should be carried out in the future. But for the time being, what the government's priority is to ensure we have those public services continuing to operate. So we are guaranteeing, come in, your wages, your salaries will be paid, and suppliers will also be paid. It'll just be that the money is routed via the official receiver rather than through Carillion.
OK. They had a meeting with you last night. They've got £1.5 billion worth of debt. How much did they ask from you?
They asked, in the last couple of days for a slice of money to.
How big a slice of money?
Well, that I think is for the board to ask. But the government's to answer. The government's position on this has been very consistent, that these contracts are about transferring risk, not just opportunity, to private sector partners, and it would not be right to say to taxpayers that you should come in and underwrite the debts of a private sector company, particularly when those difficulties have arisen, as in Carillion's case, overwhelmingly from the 3/5 of their business that is nothing to do with British government contracts.
But Mr. Lidington, surely as UK taxpayers we need to know the calculations you've made. The prospect of the government, which you are doing, temporarily funding the existing services compared to what the bailout would have been, is it not possible we could end up paying more than what they asked for last night?
You're saying funding existing services is not paying twice. Funding existing services is continuing to pay the money that we were contracted to pay in any case for the provision of those services.
But in terms of renegotiating the contracts, an increase in cost of renegotiating the ones that you want to renegotiate.
There will be where there will be a need for additional government support is for the administrative costs of the official receiver, and various associated costs to do with that. But we reckon that will be probably half of the cost had Carillion gone into an unplanned liquidation without the official receiver's involvement, and leading perhaps to a quick sell-off of all of its component businesses and assets. So doing it this way allows us to ensure continuity of supply and continuity of provision of public services, keeping people's salaries and wages paid, keeping suppliers paid, and it's doing so in a way that we think is going to be significantly less expensive for the taxpayer than the alternatives.
I appreciate that. Just a yes or no, can you guarantee there's going to be no loss to the taxpayer?
Well, I've said that there will be a cost to the taxpayer in terms of the official receiver's administrative costs. Exactly what those will be depends on how long the official receiver's work carries on and the complexity of that work.
Okay.
But the alternative would have been worse.
Why was a company that had 3 profit warnings in the space of 6 months given a £1.4 billion contract for HS2? I know it was part of a consortium. Was due diligence done? Why was that decision made?
Well, the Department of Transport weighed everything up when it came to its decision. It obviously had available to it the information about the profits warnings, but it also had available to it the track record of Carillion as a successful provider to the public sector over many years under successive governments, and the confidence of the Carillion board that they were going to be able to come to an agreement with their lenders. Now, but the Department of Transport built in to its contracts a joint sector provision so that the other joint sector contracting partners are obliged by their contract to come forward and take on the share that was given to Carillion in this case if anything were to go wrong. So the public interest was properly protected by the Department of Transport.
Why did you decide to bail out Virgin and Stagecoach in all effect, but not Carillion?
Well, that is a matter for the Department of Transport. I mean, the position that I have taken
You've just said that the decision to give the contract to HS2, which is the Department of Transport, went through due diligence. So why has this happened?
The Department of Transport, when it came to that decision, and I think in fact they were taking those decisions before the profits warning, even though the announcement actually took place afterwards. The Department of Transport took all the various factors into account, as do the different government departments, government agencies, local authorities who have responsibility for contracting within their budgets. So far as government centrally was concerned, we were presented with a request by the Carillion board very late in the day, having assured us that they were confident of a deal with their lenders over a long period of time, a request for a bailout of some kind, and we took the view collectively across government that this was not the right thing to do, and that if there was a recovery plan, as we hoped would be possible, then that was something which the companies, lenders and bankers in the commercial field ought to be willing to come forward and fund.
Given what you've said and the decisions made, you're confident in Chris Grayling's ability to do his job at the Department of Transport, given that contract being given to Carillion after the profit warning and the bailout of Virgin Stagecoach, but not the bailout of Carillion?
Yes, of course. And I think the way in which the joint venture provisions were built into those transport contracts indicates that the public interest was looked after. And the public interest and the delivery of the contracts the Department of Transport has entered into is not affected because the other partners are coming forward.
OK. Thank you very much, David Livingston, for your time.
Let's get more now on our top story in the government's handling of the collapse of Carillion. Sky's Tom Parmenter is in Smethwick in the West Midlands, near where Carillion's headquarters are based. And Tom, this is one of the areas that's really going to be hardest hit and where it's really going to be felt.
It is a very difficult day for Carillion's employees and, of course, many other people in the supply chain and who have a stake in the many different operations that this company carries out. This is actually one of the projects in the West Midlands that is most high profile, a new super hospital that is being built in this area just between Birmingham and Wolverhampton here in Smethwick, and it is a hospital that the NHS Trust say will go ahead, and they're in negotiations with the Treasury to try to make sure that that happens. Let's get a bit more detail on that from Andy Street, who is the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands. Andy Street, what is your prognosis of this very abrupt news of Carillion's liquidation?
Well, obviously, Tom, it's a very sad day for Carillion, and particularly for their employees, customers and indeed contractors. And we should start just by reminding ourselves that there has been some immediate reassurance this morning that their contracts for schools, for hospitals, for prisons will be stood by. The government have reassured this. That's the first most important concern. Next, of course, we come to the employees. I'm optimistic that many of them who are very skilled people will be able to retain their work in parts of the organisation that are very solid and will probably be brought on. And then, of course, for those who are not, we'll be working locally on a task force with the City Council, with government, with the Chamber of Commerce locally to make sure they're supported as best we possibly can achieve.
What can that task force really achieve? This is a multi-layered problem, isn't it, with lots of different questions, lots of different sectors where contracts are now up in the air.
Yes, of course it is, and of course there'll be a lot to come out in the next few days and weeks about what's gone on. But most importantly to us locally, of the building of this hospital, completing that, and making sure that as many of the employees do sustain their employment. So the task force will be looking to see those who perhaps are not going to continue in the parts of the organisation that are sold on. What skills do they have? Brilliant skills in many ways. And how can we make sure they move into new employment?
This hospital is one of the big ticket items in infrastructure in the UK, the Midland Metropolitan Hospital. How confident are you that this will open its doors in 2019?
I am very confident. I've already been talking to central government about the importance of this over the weekend, and for the West Midlands this is absolutely critical. State-of-the-art hospital that's much needed here in Sandwell in West Birmingham, and so I am certain that when the contractual arrangements are moved through, it will indeed open.
I know that you don't know the ins and outs of Carillion and what's gone wrong, but from your business perspective, you used to run John Lewis. Can you quite believe that this has happened to such a big player in UK infrastructure? Well,
I'm sure you understand. It'd be wrong to conjecture as to just what has happened, but I don't mind giving you my reaction is that I am very surprised, particularly by the scale with which this has happened. And that's why it's right that the reaction this morning deals with the most pressing issues, which are those contracts for those public institutions. But I'm sure we'll all want to understand in time just what has happened.
Okay, Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, many thanks for joining us live on Sky News. So the headline really is that a task force will be being formed today and through the course of this week to try to understand the difficulties that are left with all those contracts that are inevitably up in the air following the news of Carillion's liquidation, and of course a difficult time for a lot of those employees. But those contracts in many cases will, they are told, be taken on and in a different form, but they will in many cases continue. The work will still be there, hopefully, for a lot of the employees and the people in the supply chain supplying those big projects like the big hospital here.
Tom, thanks very much.
Well, the Transport Secretary Chris Grayling spoke to Sky News some 6 months ago about the possibility of Carillion's collapse.
They're a big British company. We all hope that they pull through with their current challenges. They're part of a consortium. They're not alone in the contracts. And we've had secure undertakings from all the members of the consortium that they will deliver that contract. So it's not where one business has to deliver. It's a group of businesses that have to deliver, and they're all committed to doing so.
That was Chris Grayling. Let's bring in Sir Vince Cable, leader of the Liberal Democrats and former business secretary, joins us, as you see, from Westminster. Sir Vince Cable, welcome to you. What's gone wrong here? A business that wasn't well run, perhaps tried to bid for contracts that were not really always going to make it by the bottom line, or a failed business model? Which is it, do you think?
Well, the problems were identified last July. I mean, we'd had 6 months of this, the share price collapsed. I think the questions that people are going to be asking is why the government continued to give very major contracts, particularly in transport, to a company that was in varying stages of collapse. Maybe, as Chris Grayling said, there were joint and several guarantees which covered the government, but you know, it's very questionable. The hedge funds saw this coming. They've made hundreds of millions this morning. They gambled against the government and its contracts, and they've been proved right. So this has been a long time coming. The chief executive did step down in July, but he'd already pocketed, I think, $6 million. He's still on full salary, as I understand it. So some people have come well out of this, and the big losers, of course, are the taxpayer, potentially enormous because of the pension protection fund that it's had to take on. Many of the workers, many of the small companies in the supply chain, they're going to be the big losers.
I mean, you introduced the concept of moral hazard in relation to the chief executive officer. I mean, in terms of the moral hazard for the people running this company, well, as you suggest, there doesn't seem to be very much. For the taxpayer, we're on the hook for a lot of money, as you say, and the comparison's been drawn with banks who were deemed too big to fail. Carillion hasn't been seen that way.
Well, I think that's right. You couldn't possibly have a situation repeating the banking crisis all over again where companies are too big to fail. But nonetheless, what this industry demonstrates is the old adage that, you know, privatisation that produces profits to the private sector, and when things go wrong, it's the taxpayer very often that picks up the bill, the nationalisation of the losses.
But Sir Vince, doesn't that ignore one potential truth, which is that as the years roll by and these companies are still working and in profit, actually what they are providing is very good value to the taxpayer. So we benefit compared to, say, what might be provided by a public sector provider who wouldn't be able to do it as cheaply.
Well, I'm not suggesting that the government can run all these contracts directly. They're struggling to have an orderly and competent system of tendering, let alone running these companies. But in some cases, local councils, government is going to have to take some of this contract work in-house, and we're going to have a proper mixed economy here. And the private finance initiative has demonstrated, I'm afraid, far too many failures, of which this is one.
Even as we're speaking, actually, Sir Vince Cable, we're just seeing some wire drops coming from a number of news agencies, principally the Reuters news agency. This is from the Prime Minister's spokesman, who says there may have been a very small number of contracts made since July, stressing they're in single digits. So seeming to suggest there that, yes, they saw which way things were being shorted, but didn't commit any big contracts. Also saying it might be necessary in the longer term to take some services in-house, and also saying the priority now is the continuation of public services. How easy do you think that continuation of public services will be? Will we simply rebadge what Carillion have been doing in prisons and hospitals and on the highways, or is it going to be more root and branch than that? And is it an indefinite liability?
Well, as I think you've just implied, I mean, some of these are going to have to be taken in-house, probably temporarily and then re-tendered, I would imagine, for example, for the big rail contracts that were let. And I'm amazed that the Prime Minister's spokesman is saying there was only a little bit of contract letting since July. I mean, there were several very large contracts, two particularly for the railways, HS2, the Corby-London electrification, hundreds of millions of pounds of contract work. And some of the contracts were let after 3 profit warnings. I mean, it wasn't as if the government were unaware of what was happening. They were very well aware of the risks.
Oh, I'm just saying a little more, actually, partly in relation to that, the Prime Minister's spokesman saying there are around 450 government contracts which have been running successfully. They are not the cause of the company's failure, says the Prime Minister's spokesman. Can we just talk about the pension fund here? Because, again, that's an area of potential public liability. We're talking about, we're told, a £580 million black hole.
Well, I'm told it's larger, but certainly it's that order of magnitude. I mean, this now becomes a government liability through the Pension Protection Fund. I mean, the workers' basic pension is protected, but as I understand it, they are going to take a hit. It could be somewhere between 10 and 20% of their pension lost. So, there are significant losses both for the government and for individuals through the pension fund.
Sir Vince Cable, thanks for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, how will, if at all, this affect our national infrastructure? Let's turn to the former, until recently, in fact, chairman of the National Infrastructure Commission, Lord Adonis. Andrew Adonis, welcome to you. What will be the impact, do you think?
Well, there are a lot of contracts that now need to be renegotiated and work that has to go to other providers. And the question which people will be asking today is how good were the government's contingency arrangements? Because people have been able to see this coming for 6 months. I mean, we've had successive profits warnings. I think mistakenly the government continued to give work to Carillion even after those profits warnings, and I think big questions will have to be asked in due course about that and what value for money that represented for the taxpayer. But the immediate question is passing these contracts, these building contracts and these service contracts to other providers, or the state itself moving in to take them over. And my view is that it may well be best value for the taxpayer for the state to move in rather than simply handing these contracts to other private operators who of course will be able to demand a king's ransom because they're taking them on in an emergency condition with no notice.
Yeah, I mean, ideologically that would be quite a step for this government to take, wouldn't it?
Well, the job of the government is to protect the taxpayer and to do the right thing for public services, and they shouldn't let ideology stand in the way. Indeed, I think a big part of the reason we're in this mess is because the government, and particularly the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, have adopted a very ideological approach to failing private sector companies, and they've wanted to prop them up well beyond the time they should have done, rather than hand the business to the state, as should have happened in extremis.
It is easy, isn't it, to look at this and say, well, just because the hedge funds were shorting things from 2015 onwards, then everybody must have known that this was a failing company. The truth is, actually, there were still some wise folk this morning who felt that the banks might step in and provide some sort of rescue plan. It was still a viable business. Gazing into the crystal ball and knowing a massive outfit like this will fail is impossible.
Well, there are two different issues here. The first is whether it was sensible for the government to be giving more work to Carillion after the profits warnings.
Well, the Prime Minister's spokesman said only a couple of hours ago that this was a very small number of contracts post-profit warning.
Well, I think that just shows how far removed they are from the concerns of ordinary people. What the Prime Minister's spokesman calls a very small number of contracts are contracts worth several billions of pounds.
Well, many ordinary
so this
people,
is huge.
Yeah.
This is huge business. But the first issue is whether it was right to give them those contracts. My view is it was wrong to give them the contracts because they become a high-risk company by the fact that they defaulted. The second issue, of course, is the existing work that they had even before those profits warnings. And there, clearly, what the government needed to do was contingency arrangements for transferring that work. And what's important is that they're not ideological about that. And if the best value for the taxpayer is for the state itself to move in, employ people, see that they're working and that projects are being delivered at least on an emergency basis, then they should do that.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, many ordinary people, as you say, many ordinary people will not have heard of Carillion, but they'll have heard of companies like British Leyland, when the state ran that type of provision. They did it very, very badly.
Well, we're talking about an emergency step. We're not talking about a permanent arrangement. What should happen now is that the state should see that these services are provided at good value and efficiently now, because, of course, this company has gone into liquidation as of this morning.
But we will be on the hook indefinitely. You know how these things have a habit of creeping on and on and on.
Well, your question is exactly the kind of ideological approach that, unfortunately, has led us partly into this mess in the first place, which is because we're not prepared to see the state undertake its duty, which is to step in and see that services are provided when the private sector fails. Because it's not prepared to do that, what actually happens is you escalate the crisis in the private sector and we end up with a complete liquidation, which is the situation we're facing today.
Yeah.
The parallel with British Leyland doesn't apply at all. British Leyland was not kept going as an emergency step to deliver contracts which had already agreed to. The state took over the company and started developing whole new car models and lines of business. That's very different.
No, I use it as an example people will remember to introduce the idea.
It's not a good example in this case. Well, what you've got at the moment is...
Let me at least offer some clarification. To introduce the idea that perhaps there are certain circumstances in certain sectors with the idea of competition where companies will tender for a contract, and you could argue sometimes they tender unrealistically and end up not being able to make a profit on it. That may be what's happened to Carillion here, but the intention is to provide best value for the taxpayer, and I'm sure the government, and I'm sure governments you've served in the past, will point to examples of where that collaboration between the private and public sector has worked very successfully for all parties.
Yeah, but it must be on the basis of successful companies and proper competition. And what we're dealing with here clearly is a failing company. And if this work is simply handed out to other private companies without any competition, then of course they'll have to be paid a king's ransom for it, and the taxpayer will end up with a very large bill. So, I don't think harking back to the 1970s is particularly helpful in dealing with what is a real crisis here in January 2018, and we need to see that we stand by the taxpayer and do the right thing.
Andrew Adonis, thanks very much.
Meantime, let's take you to David Liddington, standing by in the Commons, talking about Carillion. Here we go.
Members of the public, and particularly employees of companies in the Carillion Group, will have concerns at this time, and the government is doing everything possible to minimise any impact on employees. And let me be clear that all employees should continue to turn up to work confident in the knowledge that they will be paid for the public services that they are providing. Additionally, in order to support staff, and in this instance it will apply to staff working for the private sector as well as the public sector contracts of the Carillion Group, we have established a helpline using Job Centre Plus through its rapid response service. The government is also doing everything it can to minimise the impact on subcontractors and suppliers who, like employees, will continue to be paid through the official receiver. The action that we have taken is designed to keep vital public services running rather than to provide a bailout on the failure of a commercial company. The role of the government is to plan and prepare for the continuing delivery of public services that are dependent on these contracts, and this is what we have done. The cause of Carillion's financial difficulties is not, for the most part, connected with its government contracts, but with other parts of its business. Private sector contracts account for more than 60% of the company's revenue, and the vast majority of the problems that the company has encountered come from these contracts rather than from the public sector. Our top priority is to safeguard the continuity of public services, and we have emphasised this to the official receiver. We are also laying a departmental minute today notifying the House of a contingent liability incurred by my department in indemnifying the official receiver for his administrative and legal costs. The official receiver will now take over the running of services for a period following the insolvency of the company. The government will support the official receiver to provide these public services until a suitable alternative is found, either through another contractor or through in-house provision. The court appointment of the official receiver will allow us to protect the uninterrupted delivery of public services, something which would not have been possible under a normal liquidation process. The official receiver is also under a statutory duty to investigate the cause of failure of any company. He is under a duty to report any potential misconduct of the directors to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. My right honourable friend has asked that the investigation look at not only the conduct of the directors at the point of its insolvency, but also that of any previous directors, and whether their actions may have caused detriment to the company's creditors, and this includes detriment to any employees who are owed money. They will also consider whether any action by directors has caused detriment to the pension schemes. Carillion delivered a range of public services across a number of sectors, including health, education, justice, defence and transport, and in most cases these contracts had been running successfully. We have been monitoring Carillion closely since its first profit warning in July 2017, and since then have planned extensively in case of the current situation and have robust and deliverable contingency plans in place. These are being implemented immediately to minimise any disruption and to protect the integrity of public service delivery. Other public bodies have been preparing contingency plans for the contracts for which they are responsible. The majority of the small number of contracts awarded after the company's July profit warning were joint venture, where the other companies are now contractually bound to take on Carillion's share of the work. For example, the Kier Group, one of the joint venture partners for HS2, confirmed this morning in a release to the Stock Exchange that they had now put in place their contingency plans for such an eventuality. I recognise, Mr. Speaker, that this is also a difficult time for pension holders. The Pensions Advisory Service has set up a dedicated helpline number for staff and pensioners who have concerns about their pensions. Those who are already receiving their pensions will continue to receive payment from the various pension funds, including the Pension Protection Fund. For those people who have started an apprenticeship programme with Carillion, the Construction Industry Training Board has set up a task force to assist apprentices to seek new employment, while working with the Education and Skills Funding Agency to find new training placements, and the official receiver will be in contact with all apprentices. Companies and individuals in the supply chain working on public sector contracts have been asked to operate as usual. Normally, in the event of a company going into liquidation, the smaller firms working for it move across to the new contractor when it takes on the work. Mr. Speaker, the private sector plays an important and necessary role in delivering government services, something recognised by this and by previous governments of all political parties. Currently, 700 PFI and PF2 contracts, reflecting capital investment of approximately £60 billion, are being delivered successfully, and we also have a number of service provision contracts being delivered successfully by a range of companies. Such contracts allow us to leverage the expertise of specialist providers and deliver value for money for taxpayers. I would like to reassure the House that we are doing all we can to ensure the continuity of the public services that were provided by Carillion and to support an orderly liquidation of the company. I shall write to all right honourable and honourable members today to summarise the situation and to inform colleagues of a helpline for the use of members and their staff to provide answers to any constituency problems that may arise in the fastest possible time. Along with other ministerial colleagues, I shall keep the House updated on developments as the official receiver starts to go about his work, and I commend this statement to the House.
John Trickett.
Mr Speaker, thank you very much, and I thank the Minister for advance copy of the statement, but the House will conclude it was recklessly complacent in seeking to avoid responsibility for the government and placing the whole responsibility on the company. After all, Carillion provides 450 separate taxpayer-funded contracts to the public, with 20,000 people working directly and many thousands more in the supply chain. All of those thousands of people will have heard his reference to Job Centre Plus with a shudder of fear about them. Would he confirm that Carillion provides services to this Conservative government in 50 prisons, 9,000 schools, 200 operating theatres and 11,800 hospital beds, as well as across a whole series of infrastructure works? 4/10 of all of Carillion's income is paid for by the taxpayer, Mr Speaker. When did the government first realise that Carillion was in trouble? After all, they'd had 3 CEOs in a short period of time, 3 separate profit warnings, and back in 2015 they were already short-selling the stock on the stock exchange. And he says they were monitoring the company, Mr Speaker. But in that case, why did they leave the position of Crown representative observing Carillion vacant for more than 3 months? And how can they explain that £2 billion worth of government contracts, taxpayers' money, were awarded in spite of all of the information which has clearly been in the public domain? I myself have been asking questions in this House for over 3 months about Carillion. Why was it apparent to everybody except the government that Carillion was in trouble? The Transport Secretary in particular has questions to answer. Can the House be told what the government knew about Carillion's financial health when they awarded a £1.4 billion contract for HS2 quite recently? The Minister's failed to satisfy the House that the jobs of employees and all those in the supply chain will be safeguarded. Can he confirm that the pay, conditions and jobs of those staff is the government's priority? On this matter, why has he not had a single conversation, apparently, with representatives of the workforce about their jobs and their pensions? And shouldn't those people have a higher priority than the bonuses for the executives, which appear to have been safeguarded? Can he assure the House that Carillion is not the first in a series of dominoes of other suppliers which is about to fall one after the other? The government has announced it will pay public money, presumably to the liquidator, to carry out vital public service contracts. But doesn't this mean that the decisions about those contracts have now slipped out of the control of the government and into the hands of an unaccountable administrator? And wouldn't the simplest, most effective and democratic way to handle all of these contracts be to bring them back into the public sector, where the ethos of serving the public prevails rather than that of private profit? Isn't it the case that the government itself, the government party, had too cosy a relationship with the board chair, who is the government's chosen, and believe this or not, it's true, the government's chosen corporate responsibility czar, and who himself had urged people to vote Tory in the 2015 election?
That's how it works. It's got to be right.
It's chumocracy. Is it not time we reverse the presumption in favour of outsourcing once and for all? After all, this is not the failure of a single company, but the failure of a whole ideological system of contracting out public services. Mr Speaker, incompetent in office, reckless with taxpayers' money, helpless with public services. Isn't it time the government made way for an administration which cares and which will exercise due diligence?
So the government answering criticisms from the opposition about the collapse of Carillion. 3 profit warnings in 6 months, and yet still 8 new contracts were offered to Carillion. They have gone under, they've gone bust this weekend, with 40-odd thousand jobs at risk, at least 20,000 of those here in the United Kingdom. Now, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown is a member of the Public Accounts Committee that scrutinises how taxpayers' money is spent. Joins us from Westminster. Hello to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. How on earth could this have happened and the government not have had any inclination?
Well, of course, the government did have an inclination. It is a very serious matter when the government's second largest contractor does go into liquidation. but the government are taking a planned approach to this via the official receiver, so that the very large number of public sector contracts, school meals, hospitals, prisons, defence housing, all of these things will continue under a planned basis. And as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster made clear in the House just now, all the employees of Carillion dealing with those contracts should turn up for work, and we want to pay them via the public receiver so that these contracts continue.
So, Geoffrey, how prudent, though, was it to continue to give contracts, 8 contracts, I believe, to Carillion, when they'd had 3 profit warnings in a 6-month period?
Well, those that are the big ones that have been issued since those profit warnings are all in partnership with other big firms. So, for example, the 1.4 billion contract on HS2 will now be taken over by Kier Construction and one other person. So the big contracts, those procurement contracts, will continue. But I do think there are questions to be asked, and we have asked the National Audit Office to look into what lessons can be learned about the concentration of government contracts in one firm.
One of the issues that I've seen quite a lot of people talking about today is whether or not the link between the government offering private sector companies contracts within the public sector, if you will, is now dead in the water.
No, I don't think so at all. It's very important that we bring the private sector in so that we've got the skills and the innovation into the public sector so that we can go on improving productivity. The Labour government awarded about 1/3 of these contracts, the coalition government awarded 1/3 of these contracts, and this government's awarded 1/3 of these contracts. So I think it's essential we continue working with the private sector. It's just that we've got to tighten up on the procedures that we procure these contracts under, and that is what the National Audit Office and the Public Administration Committee will now be looking into.
Okay, so how does that, what's number 1 on that list?
Number 1 on that list is that the due diligence, the scrutiny, the financial scrutiny before a government awards a large contract should be tightened up. I think secondly, in my view, we need to look very carefully at how government procurement for these big contracts is done. And it may well be that we want to set up a new body, rather like the UK Investment Authority, which deals with the sales of government's assets and purchases. We may need to set up a similar body that looks at all big government contracts across all departments. At the moment, procurement of these big contracts tends to be done by each department, and I think it needs to be looked at on a cross-government basis.
One wonders why that hasn't been done up until now, not least because of the ramifications for developers and other clients.
I don't know why it hasn't been done up till now, but I think we do need to learn the lessons from this, what is a major company failure, and is going to have a big effect on government for a number of years to come. It's going to have an effect on the 40,000 workers. It's going to have an effect on the 28,000 pensioner members of the pension scheme. So this is a really big problem for all of us, and we will want to learn those lessons.
Big question today, Sir Geoffrey, has been why the government has chosen not to bail out Carillion when it did bail out companies like Stagecoach. The flip to that side of the coin would be actually they have, to all intents and purposes, bailed them out with all of the contracts that they were being offered while they knew that they were in trouble. What's your view?
Well, I think that we've got to be very careful how we spend taxpayers' money, and I think it is the banks and the shareholders and the creditors that should be asked to take the major brunt of what is undoubtedly a failure of this company. What the government and the taxpayer is interested in is these big contracts continuing without the individual school or the individual hospital noticing that there's been a problem, and I think that is what the government in a planned way has announced today.
How concerned are you? You quite rightly make the point that it is the second biggest company that the government works with. How concerned are you about a domino effect given what's happened today?
Well, again, I think we've got to look very carefully through these government contracts, through what when they're procured, how the supply chains in these, again, if under this failure, it could well be that some of the supply chains will be in trouble as well. And I think that is a really important matter when small companies, through no fault of their own, are getting into trouble. And I think that's one of the lessons learned that we will want to look into.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
First of all today, the construction giant Carillion has announced it's going into liquidation. It comes after talks between the firm, its lenders and the government failed to reach a deal to save the company. But what next for the almost 20,000 employees the firm has in the UK and for all the services they're currently providing? Carillion is a construction and facilities contractor, which the government pays around £1.7 billion a year for a wide range of provisions. For example, the firm is the second biggest supplier of maintenance services for Network Rail. It maintains 50,000 homes for the Ministry of Defence, and it manages part of the contract for HS2. The firm's debt pile of roughly £900 million, that's excluding hundreds of millions on a pensions deficit, stems partly from three major public-private projects: building the Midland Metropolitan Hospital in Birmingham, the Royal Liverpool University Hospital and the new Aberdeen bypass. The government's facing questions about why it contracted Carillion for more services after the firm posted the first of several profit warnings last July. Even after the share price plummeted, the government awarded Carillion part of a contract with two other companies to work on HS2, a contract worth £1.4 billion. The government also granted the firm further contracts to work on military sites and railway lines, collectively worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Despite crunch talks to save Carillion from going under, it announced today it didn't have the financial backing to continue operations. Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington said the firm's staff would continue to be paid and that services would continue to be provided either in-house or by alternative contractors. Well, earlier, the Cabinet Office Minister, David Lidington, was asked why the government had continued to award contracts to Carillion even after the company issued profit warnings.
Each department operated on the basis of the publicly known legal rules that govern the award of government contracts, and in the way that I've just described, if you look at those central government contracts that were agreed, which involved Carillion post July 2017, you'll see that they had joint venture partners who are there to take up the slack, and so that risk was covered.
David Lidington. Well, to get the latest on this, we're joined by our business correspondent, Jamie Robertson. Jamie, first of all, you've heard David Lidington there. He said that Carillion's debts came primarily from the non-public side. Is that correct?
Yes, it seems to be at the moment. A lot of the debt was involved in actually a lot of the public projects, but actually where the problem comes, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the company having debt, but a lot of the problems come from the fact that they weren't getting the payments were being delayed on many of their foreign contracts, particularly in the Middle East, it appears, at the moment. And so they have a cash flow problem where they cannot actually finance their debt. And then the banks said that they asked the banks for an extra £300 million, and the banks basically have said no, and that's why we find ourselves in the situations we're in at the moment.
So if the government had refused further contracts back in July when the first profit warnings were posted, what would have been the outcome in your view?
Well, I think then the crisis would have happened even earlier. One of the problems you're faced with is when you have a profit warning, how do you get out of it? Well, one of the best ways, of course, is to have new contracts, new profitable contracts, which are going to give you better cash flow, which are going to give you some way of financing your debt. If you don't get those new contracts, well, it'll become more difficult for you to be able to finance those projects, that debt. So, in a way, the fact that they were getting new contracts was a way of helping them, but it simply wasn't enough. The black hole, as it were, in terms of trying to finance their debt was too big.
The government is saying, the Number 10 spokesperson this morning has said that contingency measures were put in place once that first profit warning was released. And I take your point saying that actually what they needed were new contracts to keep afloat. But clearly the contingency measures that the government said were in place failed.
Yes, but it's not so much for contingency measures in terms of actually keeping those projects going have failed. We'll have to see now how effective they are at actually picking up the cycle, picking up the collapsed contracts, how the government can pick them up and how the private sector can pick them up. The real danger, I think, we're going to find here is what the kind of hiatus that occurs between these contracts ceasing, as it were, now, and being taken over either by the public sector or by the private sector. And what happens to those subcontractors, the people who are contracted to do much of this work? Will they get paid on time? Will they get paid at all? And I think that is where the problems, we simply don't know how big a problem it's going to be. But we're talking about here, I think it's a supply chain which is worth something like £3 billion a year in terms of contracts, both here in the UK and abroad. And for some of these companies who are providing services to Carillion, being paid on time becomes extremely important. And if you have a hiatus, if you have a delay which goes on for several months, you'll see some of these companies getting into real problems.
Jamie Robertson, thank you very much. Well, we're joined to discuss this by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable. On that one point, before I go to Anne-Marie Trevelyan, £3 billion in that supply chain. What is going to happen to all those companies while they wait to see what happens?
Well, the optimistic outcome is the government takes some of these contracts in-house, retenders, the workforce is kept together. I think quite a lot of the highly skilled people are certainly going to be saved, but there is potentially massive disruption. I mean, I think one of the things we ought to be looking at, the government ought to be looking at, we've got the British Business Bank. You remember we set this up in coalition. It's there to provide flows of credit for small business, and trying to put in place supply chain finance is something the government could and should be doing.
Right, but is there going to be a significant cost to the taxpayer while this process is going on?
Well, there is going to be a significant cost to the taxpayer, not least because the taxpayer's taken on the Pension Protection Fund liabilities, which are massive. We're talking 600, 800 million. The pensioners themselves will take a cut from that, but the government's on the hook. I mean, what is so absolutely galling and is going to anger people so much is the taxpayer is going to finish up paying a substantial bill for this collapse, while at the same time, I think the hedge funds have pocketed 300 million, effectively gambling against government decisions. The chief executive of the company, whose misjudgments caused all of this, pocketed, was it 6 million in bonuses, still being paid a full salary. I mean, that's the kind of injustice that does get people very angry about the way that these public sector contracts are let.
Right, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, are you angry about the fact that the taxpayer is going to shoulder the burden for what's gone wrong here?
I think the challenge we've got, and Vince raised the point, that we have the pension protection scheme to ensure that when a private company does fall over, we can protect pensions. That's really important. I think the challenge we've got, and what concerns me, and I've had constituents who run, subcontracting firms over the weekend who do construction, particularly, that we make sure exactly as Vince says that cash flow doesn't mean that those who are working for Carillion directly, those jobs will be secure. And we must make sure, and the government is working incredibly hard to actually look at that bigger picture, understand what the official receiver will need in terms of practical support to ensure that those contracts can be rolled out, and also that jobs are not at risk further down the scale.
So you'll be looking for guarantees, will you, from the government on that?
It's a matter the government has said this morning that they will do everything to support the official receiver with the government contracts that are in place, so those will continue. As Vince says, there will be disruption, I'm sure, but those projects are still needed, and those jobs will be supported and financed accordingly. And we'll be paying, as we were paying Carillion before. The official receiver will now be the person who the government is dealing with to make sure that those.
What do you say to those employees whose pensions are going to be cut?
That is one of the great frustrations when a private sector company does fail. But the fact that there is a pension protection scheme does mean that 85% of the pension is protected. It's one of the great frustrations. That's something the Prime Minister has talked about so much when she wants to make sure that that business works well, and that shareholders are empowered to actually stand up to directors when they're making poor decisions for their employees and their shareholders.
Right. So should the government have continued to grant contracts, quite a significant number of contracts, to Carillion after its first profit warning in July?
Well, as your business correspondent said, and as someone who worked in the finance sector all her life before becoming an MP, the challenge of a business that's continuing, there's an enormous business where cash flow becomes a problem for some reason, and I think some of the Middle Eastern contracts seem to have been the cause of it. Continuing to work your way through that can often work, and you bring in new contracts, you're providing a good service. But I think the government did make sure that its contingency framework was in place, because contracts brought up since that point last summer have been in joint venture arrangements, so that the risk is very much mitigated.
Right. Well, that's the government's justification. And we heard also from our business correspondent saying that actually by providing more contracts to Carillion last July, it did actually keep the company going. It would have just collapsed earlier.
Well, I don't really buy that. You asked whether Anne-Marie was angry. I'm angry on behalf of the taxpayer, and also on behalf of the 20,000 people up and down the country whose jobs are at risk, including 400 in Wolverhampton at the HQ. And as you know, I'm a Wolverhampton MP. I think there are serious questions that need answers about why they were granting more contracts when in July there was the profit warning, but also the government has a right to appoint a Crown representative to monitor what's going on in companies such as these. This is a company that has over 450 government projects. It's a huge company, and we're now seeing the result, unfortunately, not only of incompetence of the company itself, but incompetence of the government in the way that they've handled these contracts.
Do you accept, though, that some of these employees could have lost their jobs earlier if, in fact, Carillion had collapsed back in July after that first and second profit warning?
Well, who's to know exactly what was going to happen and what could have happened? But why didn't the government have a better grip of what was happening within the company after the profit warning? They could have appointed this Crown representative that they have every right to do. As far as I'm aware, they did not.
No,
so they should have known more than they did, or they did know more and they're not telling us. So
right.
We need an investigation into what they did know.
Should those contingency measures, which is what I asked Vince Cable, should they have been more robust? Because it was clear that the company was struggling. And was it correct to award the large number of contracts post that profit warning?
Well, I think the government's been clear, and obviously David Lidington this morning and Chris Grayling over the weekend have set out very clearly that those contracts that have come in since those profit warnings were in joint venture arrangements. Therefore, the risk was mitigated in that framework, and that's something that I have no doubt the government, working with the official receiver, will move forwards, will make sure that those contracts can roll out in a new format. But there will be disruption, and that is very frustrating for everyone, and particularly for those for whom there is a lack of certainty in the weeks ahead.
Well, let's have a look at the sort of broad philosophy, the arrangement of these public-private sort of contracts, if you like. I mean, is it correct now, should the government continue to award these sorts of contracts to companies like Carillion?
Well, they can do a certain amount in-house and probably should do. I suspect that the outsourcing revolution has gone too far, and as a result we're getting into situations of this kind. But when the government can't even do its tendering properly, it's difficult to imagine that it can actually run these companies properly. So we are going to have a relationship with the private sector. There are many very good private companies that didn't have the kind of extreme leverage that Carillion had, and the government is going to have to work out an arrangement with them. I think the basic principles have got to be that we can't have a situation where companies make profits in good time and offload the losses when they fail. We can't have companies that are too big to fail. Those are the basic principles. Tendering probably should operate much more on the principle of allowing in directly a lot of the smaller subcontractors, so we're not over-dependent on big tier one companies of this kind.
Right, although that was the case during the coalition government too. I mean,
Yeah,
the
no,
Carillion won part of a total of 4.5 billion. Right,
well,
but you think it now should be reduced. Do you agree? Jeremy Corbyn says it's unsustainable, that there should not be big private companies like Carillion awarded these sorts of contracts. Should all of these be brought in-house? Should they be publicly run?
I think there is a question as to whether all of them should be brought back, but I think we certainly should review quite how many are tendered out, and we have to look at how this is done. I have reservations about, for example, Vince was talking earlier about the level of remuneration that was granted to the upper echelons of this company at a time when it was in dire straits, and it's actually the lower paid people down the chain who are going to suffer, and yet, you know, the former chief executive who presided over this mismanagement was given a 1.5 million payout, and then there was even more on top of that. So there are big questions to answer as to what exactly is taxpayers' money going to? Is it going into remuneration for the chief executives, but then we're not seeing the services provided?
Right. Should some of that salary package be clawed back from Richard Howson at Carillion? £660,000 salary paid over 12 months, £28,000 of benefits, and even more money into his pension.
Well, I think this is the question that the Prime Minister has raised many times, which is that question of those huge salaries,
Should he have been paid it, though, Anne-Marie Treadle?
Well, if the shareholders are agreeing the remuneration committee within the private, sector framework that we have and the laws that exist at the moment, that is an acceptable thing for companies to do. But I think the question of whether that is enough and whether shareholders feel they have enough, robustness to stand up and disagree with that if they feel they're not getting the right job. If someone is doing a great job for a huge organisation, running a really complex set of projects, they're well remunerated, I have no problem with that.
But if they've gone bust, should he still continue, in your mind, can you justify it to your constituents that Richard Howson continues to get that money now the firm's gone bust?
Well, he won't now that it's gone bust, because all bets will be off. And the official receiver will be dealing with that.
Well, he's receiving 12 months' pay. Should he get all that money?
Well, it's a matter of whether he will if he's no longer on the payroll. That's a question for the official receiver to identify.
What do you think?
Honestly, I think that people shouldn't be rewarded for failure. But the contract that he will have set up when he joined, however many years it was before, is one that they have to honour at the time. The question is whether the shareholder empowerment is strong enough, and that's something the Prime Minister continues to look at.
Is that correct? Or should his bonuses that have already been paid be clawed back, Vince
I
Cable?
would hope so, yes. There is complicated legal issues around how the official receiver... But in principle, it's an absolute outrage that you have rewards for failure in this way. It sends a terrible example to the business community.
Right. It's taxpayers' money, this money is taxpayers' money. They do obviously have other contracts elsewhere.
So let's go back to whether all public-private contracts should be brought back in-house. You've said some. You disagree, then, with the Labour leadership, your party's leadership, that actually they should come to an end, those public-private contracts?
I don't know whether the government has capacity to provide all of the services that are currently contracted out. But I agree with Jeremy Corbyn. At the moment, what we're doing is we are taking the risk from the public sector and we're putting it into the private sector. And there are some of these companies who are taking on this risk and see what happens in the case of Carillion. That's not the case for every company that's taking on contracts from the government. But yes, I do think this needs looking at, and I do think that the taxpayer should be rightly angry about what's happened in this case.
Right, because of course under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown there were a significant number of private finance initiatives,
for example. But it's how you award these contracts, isn't it? And it's who you award these contracts to.
Do you think it should all be reviewed and actually many more of these contracts should be brought back in-house?
No, I think that, the governance needs to be robust, and in all these contracts, they were these huge complex contracts. The reality is that government has proven itself over decades never to be the best organisation to run these things. Getting the specialists...
So what's your solution?
Well, having the private sector lead on those, is a good relationship where it works. I think the question here of whether the risk management within the company and the directorship failed to actually do what needed in what is an enormously complex organisation is one that we need to think about as government and make sure that the governance arrangements and the directors are held to account early on so that these sorts of risk failures can't happen. But that is a cash flow question, and it's one that we see often. It's just that in this instance it's a company that has collected over many years an enormous number of government contracts as part of its cash flow.
Vince Cable, thank you very much.
You name it, Carillion does it. The financial collapse of a company that had government contracts in everything from school dinners to HS2 has left its own employees and so many more who work for it indirectly facing a worrying future. Carillion itself employs some 20,000 workers in the UK. The company has 450 government contracts. That's a massive portfolio. No wonder it subcontracted thousands of small firms to do some of that work. Carillion's demise has raised questions for government about the way public sector projects are handed out to private sector businesses. More on that in a moment, but first here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
This bypass near Aberdeen is Scotland's biggest construction project with a price tag of £750 million. Here's another one around Lincoln, cost £100 million. Just 2 of 450 contracts Carillion has been awarded throughout the UK. But it did a lot more than build things. Through contracts to manage schools, prisons and hospitals, it touched the lives of millions. Today, the government said it would not support the company with public money.
This is, however, the failure of a private sector company, and it is the company's shareholders and its lenders who will bear the brunt of the losses. Taxpayers should not and will not bail out a private sector company for private sector losses.
At headquarters in Wolverhampton, nervous faces and tight lips.
Have you got any comment to make?
Well, it's a disaster. There are thousands of subcontractors, agency labour, there are suppliers.
who won't get paid. We're already being told that people aren't being paid. Carillion's fuel cards are not working this morning. So staff that are trying to get to work in Carillion vans are not being able to fill up their vans. So the thing is collapsing around us, and the government seems to have this laissez-faire attitude, and they've got to take steps that assure people of their futures.
Carillion is more than the UK's second biggest construction firm. It delivers 32,000 school meals a day. It maintains NHS buildings containing 11,500 hospital beds. It provides services to 50 prisons, and as recently as November was awarded a contract to help build the high-speed network HS2.
Don't trick it.
And it was that fact that prompted angry exchanges today in the Commons.
When did the government first realise that Carillion was in trouble? After all, they'd had 3 CEOs in a short period of time, 3 separate profit warnings, and back in 2015 they were already short-selling the stock on the stock exchange.
So where did it go wrong? Big contracts like this went sour, profits optimistically banked had to be written off, blowing a hole in its finances, and with banks unwilling to lend any more money without government support, its fate was sealed. Carillion was a company that until recently paid big salaries to its bosses and big dividends to its shareholders, despite owing its banks and its own pension scheme £1.5 billion. The wisdom of awarding public service contracts to a company like that will continue. But today, the urgent concern is for those thousands of small businesses who rely on the big boys like Carillion for their payments so they can pay their own bills.
These are from November. These are invoices that we placed on Carillion for goods and services that we've supplied.
Gordon Stone supplies Christmas lights to Birmingham City Council through a subcontract with Carillion.
I have half a dozen invoices here dated back in November last year when we supplied Christmas lighting to Birmingham City Council through Carillion. These haven't been paid and they total a value of about £17,500.
And what's the knock-on effect to your business then?
Well, the consequences immediately are cash flow. We've got to have a serious look at our cash flow in the business going forward, and potentially it might mean that we have to reduce the staffing levels by 1 or 2, but we're not sure, and we're furthermore not sure whether we'll get paid any of this money at all.
Carillion workers are being urged by the government to continue to go to work while contracts are re-awarded. But with tentacles in so many areas of the economy, unravelling this bankruptcy could take many months. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll be talking to our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, in Westminster. But first, let's go to our business editor, Simon Jack, who's outside Carillion's headquarters in Wolverhampton. Simon, judging from your report, I mean, there's absolutely no secret that this was a company in trouble.
Yes, it was really ever since that big profit warning last July, most people thought of this company as a dead man walking. It was the most heavily bet against company on the London Stock Exchange. Now, the government in its own way did try to help the company by controversially continuing to award those contracts. And the hope was the company could take those contracts, go to its banks and say, look, see, we're still on the list, we still have a viable business. And that would make them reassured enough to continue to lend them money. But hemorrhaging cash, needing an extra £300 million. Once it became clear the government wasn't going to stand behind the company financially, its fate was sealed. And we're hearing tonight that workers are being urged to go to work, but many subcontractors will feel they have less guarantee of getting paid. And although the government say they have done some contingency planning, other government sources are telling me this process could be chaotic and may take many weeks, indeed many months.
All right, Simon, thank you very much. And John, to you in Westminster, what we're seeing here is a company failure, but it nonetheless raises big political questions about the role of the private sector in public sector contracts.
Yes, it has. I mean, David Livington told us today there was no question of taxpayers' money being used to bail out a private company or private shareholders. And at Westminster, there's no real dispute about that. What we have seen is the opening of an ideological division as deep and wide as anything we've seen since Margaret Thatcher began her mission to roll back the frontiers of the state in the 1980s. A senior member of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader's team, told me today he thought it was a watershed. And this week we'll see shadow Labour minister, one after another, attacking the very involvement of the private sector in prisons and hospitals and schools. And those attacks are going to be spiced up and seasoned by the idea that too often in government people have moved over to take well-paid jobs in companies on the receiving end. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, they gave a lot of business to companies like Carillion. And back then, BC, before Corbyn, there was a general acceptance across party lines. But those days are gone, and the government's having to make the case again. And that tells you a lot, George, volumes, about the new dramatic polarisation of British politics.
John, thank you very much.
The government has defended its handling of the collapse of one of its biggest contractors, which has put 20,000 jobs at risk. Carillion was placed into liquidation this morning after it failed to secure a multi-million-pound rescue deal. Ministers say they're putting in money to ensure public services run as normal and major projects such as hospitals and rail links still go ahead. But they say taxpayers will not be bailing out the private company. Our business editor Joel Hills has the latest.
Carillion is bust. The problem here in Liverpool is it's supposed to be building a state-of-the-art hospital. Some workers did turn up today, but many didn't. The NHS Trust says the project will be completed, but it's not clear when, by whom, or at what extra cost.
We heard the announcements this morning and, obviously, like I say, very disappointed and, really feel for the staff who work for them. It's a time of anxiety for them and we will try and do whatever we can to ease some of that.
Carillion is, or was, a private company, but its largest customer is the British government. It got into trouble because big projects overran. The company's debt soared past £1 billion, the banks lost patience, and the government refused to bail it out, explaining that liquidation was the best option.
Our job is to protect key public services. And that's what we're doing. We're going to pay not to Carillion anymore, but the money that we were paying to Carillion for services delivered, we will pay instead to the official receiver. So it can go into the wage slips of the workers, and I hope they will be coming into work today. They can be confident they'll be paid for doing so, and it'll go to the suppliers.
Carillion has almost 20,000 staff in the UK and runs 450 government contracts, as well as building hospitals in Liverpool and the Midlands. Carillion's one of the main contractors for the new HS2 high-speed rail network. The company helps run nearly 900 schools and almost half of the country's prisons. Carillion also helps maintain 362 defence sites for the military. One of Carillion's biggest contracts is with Network Rail. The company's paid £200 million a year to upgrade track, replace bridges and electrify parts of the network. Now, Network Rail says all of Carillion's staff turned up for work this morning, and for now, it's business as usual. But some of those contracts will go back out to tender and may end up costing Network Rail more. From Birmingham to Belfast, there are reports of workers being sent home. This project, another which appears to have ground to a halt. The pause may be temporary, but the unions are expecting job losses.
It's a domino effect that we're about to see. The big domino being Carillion has tumbled over, and it's going to start to knock others over, and that will cascade down the supply chain within Carillion.
After months of financial problems, Carillion has finally run out of road. One of the projects that pushed it over the edge was this new bypass that's being built outside Aberdeen. In this instance, work continues. The liquidator will now work out how many of the other contracts Carillion signed can be delivered as promised. Joel Hills, ITV News.
Labour accused the government of being recklessly complacent over its handling of the Carillion collapse. It emerged today that ministers handed the firm 8 new multi-million-pound contracts even after it had announced its first profit warning in July. From Westminster, here's our political correspondent, Romley Weeks.
Carillion's reach was so big that its collapse has the government scrambling to find new providers for everything from school meals to building hospitals and maintaining prisons. And also facing difficult questions over why new government contracts were still being hoovered up by Carillion, even when it was in dire straits.
We want a full investigation into what has happened here, not just the actions of Carillion themselves, but the way the government has operated in this matter. Why did they carry on awarding contracts to Carillion after profit warnings were issued?
It was on July the 10th last year that Carillion issued its first profit warning. Just a week later, the government awarded the company the contract for the HS2 project, worth over £1 billion. And the next day it received a multi-million-pound contract from the Ministry of Defence. 2 months later, the company issued a second profit warning, but still it was awarded the Network Rail contract at the start of November. Carillion's third profit warning came later that month. In total, 8 new contracts were signed since July.
What we're now seeing, I'm afraid, is a kind of pattern of behaviour of putting huge contracts in business, the way of failing private companies, because the government isn't prepared to take robust action to deliver these services by the state if that offers better value for money for the taxpayer.
The questions around Carillion's collapse will now be investigated not just by the official receiver, also by a committee of MPs who announced an inquiry into how public sector contracts are awarded right across government.
If the government was consciously letting contracts to a company in order to prop it up, that would be a very serious thing. I don't think that would be justifiable.
In Oxfordshire, where Carillion supplies school meals, the fire service was on standby to deliver sandwiches while services are brought back into council control. Better to be prepared, say the council. The question is how prepared the government was for the implosion of its key contractor. As we speak, a high-level ministerial meeting is being chaired by David Lidington, Minister for the Cabinet Office, including the Departments of Health, Education, Transport and Defence. The government is saying its top priority is ensuring no disruption to public services. That's the immediate priority, but longer term it's clear that there will be much closer scrutiny of private firms' involvement in government contracts and just who is benefiting.
OK, Romney Weeks at Westminster, thank you. And let's return then straight away to our business editor, Joel Hills. Now, Joel, this is, whichever way you look at it, this is an almighty mess, isn't it, for the administrator and the government to sort out?
Absolutely it is. Look, this is a company that a year ago was worth £1 billion, Mary. Today, it's absolutely worthless. Shareholders have been completely wiped out. The banks that underwrote a lot of this company's borrowings are on the hook for £900 million plus. They won't be getting their money back. Many will argue that's exactly how it should be. That's how capitalism should work. The government shouldn't be bailing them out. But this process is really odd. Instead of the company going to administration, it's being immediately liquidated. That probably tells you something about the financial state, but also about the government's determination to protect contracts. We don't know what's going to be happening to jobs, but the liquidator tonight said no one's lost their job, everyone's on the payroll, including, it appears, this man, Richard Howson, the former chief executive of Carillion. He left last autumn, just after the profits warning. He continues to draw a salary of £660,000 a year, plus benefits, it would appear. We don't also know what's going to be happening to the pensioners. There are 28,000 people in 14 pension schemes. It's not at all clear what will happen to them.
All right. Joel Hills, thank you very much indeed.
There are talks going on right now with members of the Cobra Crisis Committee, but this is not a crisis meeting, insists Number 10 tonight. Carillion had government contracts worth £1.7 billion from the rail network to hospitals and schools, but amid a series of profit warnings and mounting debts, the construction giant has collapsed, putting thousands of jobs at risk at an unknown cost to the taxpayer. Among Carillion's contracts, a major new hospital in Smethwick in West Midlands, which is midway through being built. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is at Carillion's headquarters in nearby Wolverhampton. Siobhan.
Well, John, it may not be a household name, but it's difficult to understate the significance of Carillion's collapse today. Talks to try and rescue the firm had continued throughout the night, but by this morning it was clear that they had failed. And at 6 a.m, the plug was pulled, leaving nearly £1 billion worth of debt and £600 million worth of pension deficit. Standing idle. The cranes above Birmingham's new £430 million Metropolitan Hospital unmanned. Work brought to an abrupt halt after spiralling costs on projects like this forced construction giant Carillion into liquidation in the early hours of Monday morning. There's normally 500 workers toiling away here, but today they've stayed away, and just a handful of officials have turned up to assess the site after the sudden collapse of Carillion, which was funding the construction of this massive hospital. Questions now over who will take over the site, what went so horribly wrong, and why the government continued to award the company with major infrastructure projects worth over £1 billion, despite 2 huge profit warnings from Carillion, one just 4 months ago. Carillion's fate hung in the balance over the weekend, but after its banks refused to lend it any more money, ministers were forced to step in and guarantee the government projects like this that Carillion was running.
Our job is to protect key public services, and that's what we're doing. We're going to pay not to Carillion anymore, but the money that we were paying to Carillion for services delivered, we will pay instead to the official receiver, so it can go into the wage slips of the workers, and I hope they will be coming into work today. They can be confident they'll be paid for doing so, and it'll go to the suppliers, who will be, supplying those contracts, and the government is continuing to pay those suppliers for that work.
In less than 20 years, Carillion rose to become Britain's second largest construction firm, with around 43,000 employees and contracts covering great swathes of government services, including hospitals, schools, roads and defence sites. Last March, the company reported it was on track, but come July, its share price tanked when it issued a profit warning, citing cost overruns at 3 key projects: 2 hospitals in Liverpool and Birmingham and a bypass in Aberdeen. Despite that, just days later, the government awarded Carillion a high-speed rail contract worth £1.4 billion, and more were to follow. But 2 further warnings were issued, one in September and another in November, as the company revealed profits had tumbled by 40%. Despite the glossy spiel, at the heart of Carillion's troubles, its aggressive pursuit of contracts meant they were operating on wafer-thin margins, so that when costs started to spiral, debts quickly mounted, reaching £900 million.
It was folly by the government, folly with people's livelihoods. It put people's whole existence at stake, and it's put other companies at stake who have done business with Carillion based on the contracts that this government have foolishly given them.
Tonight, Carillion is in the hands of the government's insolvency service, while its near £600 million pension deficit has been taken over by the Pension Protection Fund, meaning an inevitable cut to payouts for existing employees.
No one from inside Carillion has spoken today, other than a statement from the chairman, who expressed his deepest regret that we have arrived at this decision. He and the other bosses already face a formal investigation by the city regulator as to the timings and content of the company's profit warnings. And today there are calls for a full parliamentary investigation into Carillion's demise. But that's for the future. Tonight it's the tens of thousands of employees and subcontracting firms who rely on Carillion for their livelihoods, who are struggling to calculate what this unprecedented demise means for them.
So for now, it's the government funding major projects like this hospital, while 2 of Carillion's partners on other major schemes, HS2 and military homes, have said they'll step in and pick up the pieces. But with £16 billion worth of contracts, the work untangling Carillion's collapse is only just beginning.
Well, John, as well as the huge costs being passed to the taxpayer, there'll no doubt be rising outrage at the $660,000 salary that's still being paid to Richard Howson, who is the former boss of Carillion, who was ousted last year and who is still due to receive that salary until October of this year. And consider this, when the company published its annual report last year, it changed the terms of how bonuses can be clawed back from key executives. In the past, bonuses could be clawed back simply for corporate failure, but under the new rules, those bonuses can only be clawed back if earnings are misstated or if individuals are found guilty of gross misconduct. Now, that means, John, that in other words, despite Carillion's collapse today, individuals like Mr. Howson and the company's chairman, Philip Green, could still receive hefty payouts.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting there. And as if on cue, in Whitehall right now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is arriving. He'll require deep pockets, but it'll be taxpayers' money that is sitting at the bottom of them if anything's to be done to save all the work Carillion was doing. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Well, Downing Street confirmed today that no fewer than 8 contracts have been signed with Carillion since that profit warning in July, while it's emerged that a government representative to manage the relationship between the firm and the public sector was rotated off at around the same time. Now, that's added fuel to Labour's fury. They've accused the government of shocking negligence, while ministers insisted that taxpayers should not and will not bail out a private sector company. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
A massive new workload for a government at full stretch. It must safeguard public sector projects like the construction of the Royal Liverpool Hospital that Carillion was under contract to deliver. And today the government also had to answer questions about why it carried on awarding contracts when the company had already raised the distress signal last summer. Barely a week after Carillion's first profits warning, the company, along with others in a joint venture, picked up a £1.4 billion government contract for HS2. The very next day, it picked up £150 million worth of contracts for military catering. And after the second profits warning, it picked up 2 Network Rail contracts. After the third profits warning, still more government contracts for school construction.
I think that the government almost certainly were feeding contracts to Carillion, hoping to head off this disaster because they had a serious cash flow problem. The government's now claiming that it was actually covering the risks. Well, we'll see. It needs to be investigated.
The government insisted it had not been effectively bailing out the company with recent contracts.
It is the company's shareholders and its lenders who will bear the brunt of the losses. Taxpayers should not and will not bail out a private sector company for private sector losses or allow rewards for failure.
But Labour said the failed company's bosses were walking away from the crash scene unharmed and had been too close to the government.
Isn't it the case that the government itself, the government party, had too cosy a relationship with the board chair, who is the government's chosen, and believe this or not, it's true, the government's chosen corporate responsibility, sir, and who himself had urged people to vote Tory in the 2015 election. It's chumocracy.
Carillion's work on the Lincoln bypass was still going ahead today. The businessman turned civil servant who's been managing the Carillion saga for the government told MPs the government's part-time Crown representative was moved out of Carillion last summer. But he insisted the government had done a blinding job managing its relationship with the company, and failures would happen in the private sector.
In many ways, this is the failure of a private sector company. It failed to reach agreement with its lenders in the final analysis, and I think that government, some wheel is going to come off sooner or later somewhere in the system.
Across the public sector, the outsource first dogma has wreaked havoc. This is a watershed moment.
Jeremy Corbyn sees it very differently. In a viral ad emailed to supporters tonight, the Labour leader says all public sector work given to Carillion should come back to the public sector.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, minutes before we came on air, I spoke exclusively with the Conservative MP and Cabinet Office Minister Oliver Dowden. Above all, Minister, this is a human catastrophe for many, many workers. Do we know how many are going to be affected by the liquidation of Carillion?
Well, as you rightly say, this is a very regrettable situation, and I would urge all employees to turn up for work. What the government is seeking to do through its contingency planning is to ensure that continuation of public services. So we are hopeful that all those public services will continue to be delivered, and the public servants who work for those services will continue to have their jobs and will not be affected. Now, that's the situation in respect of the 40% or so of the company that delivers public services. Clearly, the remaining 60% are in the private sector. Now, we've said we'll guarantee their payments for the next 48 hours, but beyond that, it is in the hands of the official receiver, and the government is working to provide all the support that it can.
So let's clarify that the government element, which is roughly a third, I think, that's guaranteed anyway, whatever happens for however long it takes. But the other 2/3 is not guaranteed.
Well, as I said, it's guaranteed for the first 48 hours. Beyond that, this is clearly a private company, and we were put through the business department the support in that we would for any other private company in that situation. What we are doing is contingency planning and implementing the contingency planning for those involved in public service delivery, because we have to ensure that we have continued delivery of public services. And I can say I just received a briefing on this. So far, we have received no reports of interruption to the delivery of public services.
But this crisis has been long in the coming. I mean, ever since July the 10th last year, when the first profits warning came, you knew that there was a problem, and yet more contracts were thrown to Carillion to try and rescue them. But it was quite clear they were beyond rescue.
Well, you rightly say there was a profits warning last year, and in response to that, the government undertook contingency planning. Now, you wouldn't expect the government, or indeed any private company, simply to cease to contract with another company when there's been a profits warning. But what you would expect it to do is to plan for that eventuality, and that's what we did. And we did that principally by ensuring almost all the contracts issued subsequently, and I must say they were a very small number, only 2% of contracts with Carillion were issued post that profit warning. We ensured that they were structured by joint ventures so that the risk was shared with other companies, and indeed we are confident that all those contracts will continue to be delivered on.
Now, the official receiver has the power to investigate what went wrong. Are you urging him to do so?
Yes, and indeed that is exactly what the government has done. As you rightly say, this is a matter for the official receiver, but the official receiver must investigate this properly, and the government will be supporting him in doing that as an independent actor.
Now, Vince Cable, who was in coalition with you in the last government, in the David Cameron government, a third of the contracts that went to Carillion were fixed during that period. And he's saying now, Vince Cable is saying, that the government overdid it, that far too much stuff was put in the way of this company.
Well, I mean, as you rightly say, this isn't one particular political party. A third were let under the last Labour government, a third under the coalition, and a third under the current Conservative government. Clearly, in the longer run, there will be lessons to learn about some of these contracts, and I understand already that the relevant select committee will be investigating it, and we will look at that. But really, the first priority for the government, certainly over the weekend, has been to ensure the continued delivery of public services. And as I said, the latest briefing to me indicates that we are achieving that delivery.
There are very few companies like Carillion. They are massive. There are said to be about 8 or 10 of them, very few that you can really contract with. This isn't a good way of doing business at all, is it? Let's face it, you're for free enterprise, not for sort of bunging stuff to companies that actually can't cope.
Yes, and well, that's why the government has actually set a target of ensuring more small and medium enterprises bid for and receive government contracts. So that target was set at 25% in the last Parliament. We delivered on it. We've now set a target for 33%. Of course, we need to ensure that the market is as diverse as possible, because in that way the risk is shared more broadly.
After that first profits warning, the CEO stepped down, but he's to be paid until next October, his full salary. That can't be right, can it?
Well, I quite understand the concern that many of your viewers will have about that, and certainly employees of Carillion will have about that, but that really is a matter for the official receiver, and the government has been urging the official receiver to investigate exactly those sort of issues.
And just finally, to go back to where we began, you don't know really in the end how many jobs are at risk.
Well, as I said to you at the beginning of the interview, John, in relation to those contracts where they're delivering public services, the role of the government is to continue delivery of those public services, and that's what it's doing. And those people can be absolutely sure that they have their jobs. In relation to the
how many is that? How many is that?
Well, it is the number of people who are employed in across a whole range. We're talking about tens of thousands of people.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Cabinet Minister Oliver Dowden talking to me earlier. Well, joining us now, the Labour peer, Lord Adonis, former chairman of the National Infrastructure Commission. He resigned that role just a couple of weeks ago, and Conservative MP Gillian Keegan, a member of the Public Accounts Committee. I mean, what seems quite extraordinary is that even more contracts were thrown at this company back after July the 10th profits warning. There was one on the 10th, another on the 17th, and yet another on the 18th. I mean, how many contracts were they prepared to throw at it to try and save it?
Well, I think, you know, obviously we have a concentration of within this supplier, and I would imagine that, you know, when you're faced with that situation, you don't normally pull out because of a profits warning, but I guess the way they contracted those last couple of contracts, they did actually have a sort of contingency risk-sharing arrangement in there where the contracts where other suppliers had to
But it has
be
a
able
feel
to
of
pick up.
panic, doesn't it? I mean, come on, let's try another one. Well, one more. Well, yet another. Let's try.
I would doubt it, but I would imagine there are things... I mean, government procurement takes a long time, so I would imagine there were things that were already in train and were already well in train. And I guess, you know, you've also got to be conscious as a government of signalling to the marketplace as well. So it is quite a complex set of situations. And actually, given the breadth of business that already is with this company, in a way, the biggest concern is not actually the last 3 contracts, but it's actually the concentration and the high number of contracts across many different departments within one, within one company.
Let me ask you, Andrew Adonis, I mean, did you sniff trouble? And is that one of the reasons why you left?
No, I didn't have anything to do with Carillion,
no,
because that's the letting of contracts, and I'm afraid I read about these contracts in the newspapers. However, what I was struck by at the time when these contracts were awarded after the profits warning is it was quite controversial at the time. The Financial Times, the reputable business newspaper, said at the time that this was a high-risk strategy, because what happened, remember, is that when you had the first profits warning, Carillion's share price went down by 70%. This wasn't an ordinary profits warning. This was a declaration of crisis at the company, a really serious crisis. The share price collapsed. The chief executive left, which is always a sign that that really serious situation has developed. And then what happened was Chris Grayling let the HS2 contract, which was the first of them, a 450 million contract in respect of Carillion, and the share price then went up by nearly 20%. And the FT itself reported that this was, as it saw it, a lifeline to the company, which the government was giving, and high risk. Now, as soon as I read that, I thought, well, I wouldn't be doing this if I was the minister. You know, I've done his job. I would absolutely not have taken the risk of putting a big contract the way of a company where the chief executive had just gone and you'd had a major profits warning.
Isn't one of the problems when you look at this, I mean, even if you manage to get 25% small and medium-sized businesses to step into this void, the fact is, at the moment, we have, as I said to the minister, we've got, perhaps 10 maximum of these big companies, but they don't really appear to be the right kind of device to deliver such extraordinarily complex and different contracts. I mean, anything from building a school to a hospital to running a railway. I mean, this isn't really a clever idea, is it?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the heart of their downfall, actually. They've probably overexpanded, and their diversification strategy...
Encouraged to do so by the government, though. I mean, the government wanted the infrastructure, and so, come on, here's a company willing to do it.
Well, I mean, it's not the only supplier of this kind of infrastructure. There are others as well.
Not many.
But actually, they consolidated, right? They bought a lot of companies within the sector. So almost by default, you've got this kind of consolidation. And, consolidation happens in industries a lot, particularly where you've got price-sensitive kind of procurement and economies of scale matter. And it's something that will need to be looked at, because sometimes that can go too far. And as we've seen, it's left them exposed.
But you were in government, in fact, of course, when the first of these contracts were sort of let, and you wonder, was this a clever way to do things? Wouldn't it better to have more dependable, smaller companies doing a more diverse quantity of work?
Well, we do need many more smaller companies which are contracting. But let's be clear, when I was responsible and we were contracting, we were not contracting with companies with major profits warnings where there was an imminent risk of collapse. You see, the big issue, which we need to pay attention to, because it may only be 2% of their work, but let's be clear, it's £2 billion worth of contracts that were entered into after the profits warning. And my own view is that there will need to be a public inquiry about this, because the issue of value for money for the taxpayers and entering into those contracts with a company which just by reading the Financial Times, is in a desperate state. I think that's going to be a very major issue in politics.
A very brief question. I mean, is this soluble? I mean, can all these contracts be rescued? And what about the workers?
Well, I mean, the workers is obviously the first, and the pensioners, indeed. In fact, my father worked for this company for his whole career, so he's sitting there worried about his pension as well. So, for sure the workers, for sure people who are relying on the pensions. In terms of can they be rescued, there's still, the markets that they were in actually are good markets. There's still a lot more construction. There's still a lot more need for these services to be run. It's not like they're contracting, they're expanding. So yes, in theory, there should be a good market for someone to step into. And there are other companies, and in the case of as Lord Adonis said, the ones that have recently been let, they were contractually let in a way that the other suppliers, there was a consortium, and they have responsibility already within the contract to take over the work of Carillion. And that was how they dealt with that difficult situation of whether to provide a lifeline or be the death knell.
Gillian Keegan, Lord Adonis, thank you both very much for coming in.